to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's program, Ukraine Strikes Back, the counteroffensive that could decide the war, with National Security Analyst and Author Joe Cirincione, and our moderator, Khrystyna Holynska. She's Assistant Policy Researcher at the RAND Corporation and also a PhD candidate at the Pardee RAND Graduate School. For those of you who would like to submit questions, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen where you can type in your questions at any time. Rachel Kenderdine will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, which will start in about 35 to 40 minutes. So with that, Joe and Khrystyna, I welcome you both to this very timely and important discussion, and I turn it over to you, Khrystyna.
Thank you, Kim. Welcome, Joe. Welcome to our audience. It is my pleasure to start today's conversation with Joe. Several months ago, as we were making arrangements and discussing what this event will look like, we both acknowledged that the topics might change dramatically between then and now. But the pace of events, especially over the past few weeks, increased significantly. We had some very devastating developments very recently, but also some events that can hopefully make us more optimistic. We will not be able to discuss everything in the next hour, but we will do our best to focus on things that concern the most. Before I turn to my questions, I would like to invite you, Joe, for some opening remarks to set the stage for today's discussion.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council for inviting us to talk with you today. This could not be more timely. There's a ton to unpack, so I'll keep my opening remarks brief. I just want to open up with a couple of comments on why we should care about this, why we should be supporting Ukraine, why the Ukraine war matters. And just yesterday, I was asked by Newsweek magazine to write a column on this, why we should support Ukraine. I didn't hesitate at all. This is a subject that is very important to me, very dear to me. It strikes at sort of the heart of what I believe as a human being, as a national security analyst. And I wrote the article and I made 3 points. And the first point is that we should be supporting Ukraine because it's the moral thing to do, that this is who we are. When free democratic people are attacked by an autocratic nation, when their country is invaded, we rush to their aid. We do not turn our backs. That is what America stands for at its best. Putin's war has been a brutal occupation. If there's been any doubts about who the good guys are in this, I think those have been answered definitively by the way Putin has conducted his occupation. He is waging a war of mass destruction on the Ukrainian territory. He has leveled cities. He has rounded up and killed local elites. He has murdered any men of military age. He has forced millions of Ukrainians to flee their homes. Millions have been forcibly, or about 1.2 million have been forcibly deported into Russia. And this includes tens of thousands of children who have been taken from their parents in some cases, orphanages emptied out of children, brought into Russia for re-education and adoption. This is a genocidal war. He wants to eliminate Ukraine as a nation, as a people, as a culture. He wants to eradicate their history. Whose side do you think we should be on? But that's not the only reason. Even if you think there are terrible things going on in other parts of the world, this is uniquely central to American security concerns. There have been many other countries who have invaded their neighbors. We have conducted unjust, unnecessary invasions of other countries. But no one, since World War II ended, has tried to forcibly redraw the map of Europe by force. If this is allowed to stand, Europe will be destabilized. A settlement calling for a ceasefire, for example, an end to hostilities, leaving the Russian troops in occupation of approximately a fifth of Ukrainian territory, would not sate Putin's appetite, it would stimulate it. It is largely expected that he would go on to his other territorial ambitions, which includes small countries like Moldova and the Baltic states themselves, which Putin has said he considers rightfully Russian. And finally, there's economic reasons. Europe is one of our largest trading partners. There's about $1 trillion annually in goods and services that cross the Atlantic. A lot of this is done through the cooperation with the European Union. One of Putin's goals is to smash the European Union, is to replace it with economic and security pacts that would be headed by Russia or Russia and China, his partner in many of his global endeavors. This would, of course, have devastating impact economically for the United States. Sometimes in foreign affairs, you have to choose between what's morally right and what is in the country's strategic interests. In the case of Ukraine, all our interests align: morality, security, economics. We don't have to choose here. It's clear that we should be supporting Ukraine, that this is one of the most essential conflicts and struggles in the world today. I'm glad that the President of the United States has seen fit to strongly support Ukraine, and I expect that to continue on a bipartisan basis, at least for the rest of this year. There, I hope I've set the stage.
Thank you. Thank you for setting the stage in a very optimistic way, but I cannot help talking about a very recent devastating development that occurred in Ukraine in the past few days. Our topic today is Ukraine strikes back, and we will definitely touch upon the counteroffensive a lot today, but before that, I would like to ask you about the destruction of dam of Kakhovka hydroelectric power station and the devastating flooding of large Ukrainian territory. As a result of that, it might have an effect on the counteroffensive. But before we talk about that, let's hear what you think actually caused that. There are three sets of opinion in the media. Within hours of this incident, Russia started actively pushing a narrative that it was done by Ukraine, a very unified voice coming from Russian officials, media, even military bloggers, saying that Russia is a victim, Russia would not benefit in any way. On the other side, Ukraine and the West blame Russia, and Russia can be blamed in two ways. First, doing it intentionally, destroying the dam in purpose and causing the flood, or simply mismanaging it. And we have many examples, even from the past year and almost year and a half, of Russia not being managing properly the territories or the infrastructure that it captured. What do you make of all that?
All right. I understand why there could be some confusion about this, but you have to put this in context and understand this. Since the beginning of the war, almost everything Russia has said has proven to be a lie, and almost everything Ukraine has said has proven to be true. And in this case, at the Novokakhovka dam, Russia has occupied it for about 15 months, illegally seized it, illegally occupying it. We know that. They have wired it with explosives. We know this. Ukrainian officials have told us this, and there's evidence photographically through surveillance and intelligence that they have done this. So is it possible that Ukraine did this? I suppose you'd have to say it's possible, but there's no way. This doesn't benefit Ukraine. It's disrupting their counteroffensive plans. It is killing hundreds, perhaps thousands of their own citizens. It could cause an immense humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine itself. So there's no real motive for Ukraine to do this. Is it possible that their poor management of the dam caused the dam to collapse? That is possible. So we'll have to look in the next couple of days to see if there's any photographic or other evidence of an actual explosion at the dam. U.S. officials keep talking about explosion, so I'm led to believe that we do have some intel that has not yet been released. And finally, there's just, when you're looking at a crime, you always look at whether the person had the means the motivation, and the opportunity. And when you look at Russia, all those line up. They certainly had the means to do this. The occupation of the dam, they possessed the dam, not Ukraine. The wiring of the dam, they had the means to do it. They had indicated that they might do, they had done similar things in the past, blowing up similar crossings of the Dnipro River in order to block the Ukrainians from advancing across that formidable geographic barrier to any Ukrainian military operations. Did they have the motive? Yes. The Ukrainian offensive, and we'll get into this later, hasn't yet started, but you see Ukraine starting to take offensive actions, what we call actions to shape the battlefield, probing actions, armored assaults in about 7 or 8 different areas along the 600-mile front. You've seen that begin to happen, especially up in the Bakhmut area. There's reports today of some heavy fighting in the Zaporizhia province or oblast that you hear today. So while the offensive hasn't fully begun, the preliminary activity is now underway, and it's very possible that Russia's motivation was to disrupt that, was to prevent the Ukrainians from advancing, and they certainly had the opportunity to do it. Now, one counterpoint to that, and then I'll stop here, is that it appears that the flooding has wiped out many of Russia's own defensive positions. So the defensive positions that they've had on the east of the Dnipro River, which is where they occupy the territory, and Ukraine on the west of that river, that many of those eastern dug-in defended positions have been wiped out. Apparently, these troops had no indication that flooding was coming. Apparently, hundreds of Russians have been killed already just by this. And then some people say, well, why would Russia do that? And the reason is Russia has been conducting a very stupid war. This is not the first time in the war that Russia has done something that is self-defeating, that is a disastrous maneuver. So this is sort of keeping in character with the way Russia has conducted the war itself. I cannot overstate the low opinion most military analysts in the world have of the Russian leadership, both political and military, in the conduct of the war. So it's perfectly possible that one section of the Russian military thought this was a brilliant idea. They didn't inform the other section of the Russian military, and it's turned into a disaster for Russia. That's a short analysis of what may have happened there and who did it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And this is a big issue that we will be discussing for a long time from so many different perspectives, including the environment, including the nuclear topic that we will turn to a little bit later. But let's stay on the dam and the counteroffensive for now. How can this incident affect Ukraine's counteroffensive? As you said, it has not started yet. Some experts say that it is starting or started. It's just not a moment in time when the counteroffensive, somebody pushes the button and it's on. It's a set of activities that leads to what we will later in history call counteroffensive. So how can this incident affect Ukraine's counteroffensive? And what do you think with the start of the counteroffensive being so vague, what the end of it can be? What are the objectives that Ukraine is putting forward for this counteroffensive?
Well, there's two ways you can think of right off the top about how it impacts the counteroffensive. And one is it diverts government resources. There now has to be a massive rescue effort underway for this critical part of the country, where this dam feeds into the lower eastern part. The Dnipro River feeds into the lower eastern part of Ukraine, including the vital city of Kherson, which was just liberated by Ukrainian forces last September. And many people thought that you might see a thrust from the Ukrainian military across the Dnipro River there into the eastern banks and therefore and deeper into Russian occupied territory. That's clearly off the cards right now, at least for the moment, because of the disruption of the river. So you've got a disruption of logistics, of transportation, of the ability of Ukrainian military forces to really move in any part south of the dam, and you have the diversion of resources. Those are the two main ways it's disrupting it. Since this is a 600-mile frontier, there's still plenty of other areas where Ukraine can operate. And even nearby, Zaporizhzhia is located north of the dam. And that's where some heavy fighting is reported today. So you may be seeing Ukrainian actions that are trying to, overcome the logistical problems that the dam rupture has presented.
Mhm. Thank you. And as we were talking about counteroffensive for months now, with spring turning into summer, Russians have also been watching what Ukraine was doing or was preparing to do. Do you think Russia, having a chance to observe the developments, all the discussions, was able to prepare to counter this Ukrainian offensive actions? How effective Russia's defense can be in this case?
Well, Russia attempted, I think, three things in the past this year. And one was, remember, they had their own offensive. It failed. It was so terrible that, in fact, you hardly noticed it. But Russia tried a winter offensive to gain the rest of the Donbass region. They control about half of the Donbass at this point, and they've declared that all of this area is Russian territory. They have annexed it, right? Even though they don't control it. So they were going to make a push to get the rest of Donetsk province, for example. They failed miserably. They gained 1 or 2 kilometers in some places. That was failure number one. Failure number two was they then tried to get a symbolic, at least, victory by the capture of Bakhmut. And that too turned into a failure, even though right now Russian troops do in fact control most of the city of Bakhmut. In the process, US intelligence estimate that they lost 100,000 soldiers dead, plus an equal amount in casualties, mainly in the effort to capture Bakhmut. It's a sign of what I was pointing to before, the stupidity of the Russian military operations, sending their troops, some well-trained, some mercenaries like the Wagner Group, some conscripted convicts, some conscripted Russian citizens with little or no training. They just did human wave assaults into the teeth of the Ukrainian defenses. The Ukrainians cut them down. Even while they were ceding ground a block at a time, the Russians took horrendous losses. Just to put this in perspective, we think approximately 200,000 Russians have been killed in this war. 200,000. A couple of miles south of where I am right now is the Vietnam War Memorial. There's 54,000 names on that memorial. That was in 10 years of U.S. combat in Vietnam, the most ferocious war we fought since World War II. 54,000, 10 years, 200,000 in 15 months. This war has been a disaster for Putin. He is losing this war. The offensive failed, and he was stuck. So what else does he try to do to defend his position right now? Dig defenses. For the past 6 months, you've seen Russian forces digging trench lines, backed by trench lines, backed by trench lines, putting up anti-tank obstacles, sowing what we believe to be tens of thousands of mines. He's trying to make this as costly and as difficult as possible for the Ukrainians to breach those lines. And unfortunately, it is going to be bloody. It is going to be costly. I mean, anytime you go on the offense and you try to take a well-defended position, you're going to take heavy casualties. And what the Russians have seen is that over the last 6 months, the Ukrainians have been armed by the West with heavier equipment, tanks, armored personnel carriers, towed artillery pieces, mine-clearing equipment, helicopters, and most recently, the promise of jet fighters. And you've seen them trained by the West. You've seen thousands of Ukrainian troops, some flown here to America, many in Europe being trained for this kind of what we call combined arms operations. This is very difficult to coordinate, to do this kind of thrust. The Ukrainians are now, we believe, well equipped to do this. And I expect to see tens of thousands of Ukrainian armed, trained, well-equipped forces engaging in decisive thrusts into Russian territory once the preliminary battles determine where the weak points are, where they might be. What Ukraine hopes to do, I think, is to not just breach the barriers, but to cause a panic in the Russian forces, who most of whom are still under-equipped, under-trained, in some cases underfed, and have terrible, terrible leadership. So it's quite possible that you could see major breaches in the Russian defenses, the way we saw last September and October, when the Ukrainian forces advanced in the Kharkiv province and pushed the Russians back by tens of kilometers, in some cases 100 kilometers back. So that's the kind of thing we're anticipating, and we expect to see that play out this month and next.
Mhm. Thank you. The destruction of the dam once again brought to the forefront the issue of nuclear security, which remains salient throughout the war, but it's on and off in the media discussions and in the public attention. The International Atomic Energy Agency said that there is no immediate danger to Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, but the threat remains. In one of your recent publications, you called the plant Ukraine's ticking nuclear time bomb. What are the dangers surrounding this plant, and what role can it play in this war more broadly?
I think you have to think, Putin thinks like various brutal autocratic leaders in the past, that they have a scorched earth policy. Think Hitler, as he was losing World War II, and he asked, is Paris burning? That he wants to leave behind devastation, one, just act of vengeance and retribution, but also in the hope that this will blunt the offensive forces and will preserve his positions on the battlefield. In order to, and that's, the dam explosion fits into that kind of thinking, and also fits into this is the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. We've heard Putin make numerous nuclear threats before the war, during the war. They've died off a bit since, but he's trying to use his nuclear weapons as a protective shield to try to stop the West from intervening, threatening that any help to Ukraine could lead to a NATO-Russia conflict, could lead to nuclear war. One of those nuclear threats is not directly nuclear weapons, but it's the plant. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. When it was fully operational, it supplied Ukraine with 20% of its electricity. So that gives you some idea of how big it is. It's got 6 different reactors on it. Russia seized it, again, illegally seized it, illegally occupied it, and has run it for about 15 months. They've cut the staff by 2/3, so you have staff shortages there. They've harassed and intimidated the staff. There's fighting going on around the nuclear power plant. So you're worried about an accident at the plant that could result in the release of large amounts of radioactive material. This would not be a nuclear explosion, so it's not Hiroshima or Nagasaki, but it could be an overheating of the fuel rods that produces a large amount of hydrogen gas that then ignites in a radioactive chemical explosion that releases plumes of radioactive debris tens of miles, hundreds of miles, even thousands of miles, depending on conditions. Think Fukushima. That's what happened at Fukushima. And it happens when the electricity is cut off to a plant and you can no longer cool the fuel rods, where the water necessary to cool the fuel rods is cut off, and that's what causes the overheating, either in the reactors themselves, which actually at this point is less likely, more likely in the cooling ponds, where there are thousands of fuel rods still hot, needing to be constantly cooled by circulating water. So that was a situation before the dam burst. And now the dam just adds to the problem. Remember, the problem at the south of the dam is flooding. The problem north of the dam, where the Zaporizhzhia reactor is a decrease in the water levels. All that water is now, that was held back by the dam, is now flowing, and you're seeing the water levels drop by several meters every day. I think Rafael Grossi, the Director General of the IAEA, said 15 meters in the last day. If it drops at that rate for another day or two, that means that the water supply from that river or lake that's fed by that river outside the plant will no longer be available to supply cooling water to the Zaporizhzhia facility. So you can no longer get water from the river, the Dnipro River, to cool the fuel rods. Fortunately, the Ukrainians had planned on this. Built into the design of the plant is a holding pond, a cooling pond there that can keep cooling the fuel rods for at least a couple of months, which is why Director Grossi said there's no immediate risk. But he warned, the integrity of that cooling pond is vital. Any breach to that pond, bang, the water goes, the fuel rods heat up, you get the explosion. Any fighting in the area, and there is fighting in the area, could result in the loss of electricity. Without electricity, the pumps don't operate. There's diesel generators that can last for a few days, but then they go out of gas. And again, you have an overheating of the fuel rods. That's why it's a ticking nuclear time bomb. That's why Grossi said that we've avoided a nuclear threat there by luck. And so to me, this is one of the most dangerous situations in the war over the next few weeks. We could see Putin, the fighting, intentionally or unintentionally cut the electricity or the water. There's reports that Russia has put explosives in the plant, in addition to the military vehicles and equipment that is stored there. We believe he's wired certain parts of the plant. He could blow that. You could see this go off in a number of different ways. None of them are encouraging. We have to keep a close eye on this facility.
So continuing on the topic, on the nuclear topic, and now talking more specifically about nuclear weapons and recent Russia's transfer of tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus. You called it a significant development again in your publications that is unprecedented since the Cold War, but you also said that this is a sign of desperation of Putin, who's losing the war, slowly exhausting the military options that he had or he thought he had. So he's trying to bring up the nuclear saber rattling again. This was big news several weeks ago, then it slowly disappeared from the agenda. We should definitely monitor the situation, but what specifically should we look for in this situation? Was it an additional failure by Putin to make a threat credible, or did it perceive what he was anticipating? Did he achieve what he perceived he would achieve with the threat?
No, he didn't get what he was hoping for, but it's not the end of his threats. Here's the quick context. During the Cold War, both the Soviet Union and the United States based nuclear weapons in their allied territories. We had thousands of nuclear weapons based in European countries. The Russians had thousands of nuclear weapons based in their Warsaw Pact countries. In 1968, we negotiated the Non-Proliferation Treaty that restricted the ability of countries to get new weapons, and all the countries pledged to work towards nuclear disarmament. It took a while for the countries to do that, but eventually we did. Since 1968, there's been no new country that has had nuclear weapons placed in it. So that's the context. It's been a very long time since anyone's done anything like what Putin is saying he wants to do. This is not normal international behavior. At least it hasn't been for 60 or 70 years. The second thing is, when the Cold War ended, a lot of those weapons came out of the countries. First the United States, and then Russia agreed to pull back their forces. Thousands of nuclear weapons were pulled out by both countries of these and stored or eliminated. So at present, the United States maintains about 100 nuclear weapons in 5 different European countries. Russia doesn't have any. They've consolidated them all into Russian territory until now. And what Putin is saying is, well, you know what? We want to bring some of those back to Belarus, which used to hold Soviet nuclear weapons when the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics existed. Lushenko, who's heavily reliant on Putin, Lushenko's the head of Belarus, agreed to this. Nothing's happened yet. Putin said he wants to do it by July 1st, but we have no indication that anything's moved. But this is part of Putin's saber rattling. Since it's pretty clear he cannot win the war militarily, and he's a very good possibility that he could lose the war militarily, he has to come up with something else, some other way to get Ukraine to stop fighting, to accept a ceasefire that would leave Russia in control. Well, one of the ways to do that is to scare the West or scare the Ukrainians and to threaten the use of nuclear weapons should A, B, or C happen. Those verbal threats have lost their punch right now. We've heard them so often and nothing has happened. It's the boy who cried wolf. We don't believe him anymore. So he's got to raise the ante. He's got to do something more dramatic. The movement of nuclear weapons is something dramatic. So here's what I would expect: June, July. I would expect more announcements about movement. I would expect physical evidence of movement. I would expect him to do this. He wants to have videos of special nuclear trains carrying these nuclear weapons out of their storage facilities, moving them to Belarus. Armored convoys going down Russian roads, bringing the nuclear weapons. I would expect him pictures of Russian officials in Belarus inspecting these weapons, maybe pictures of the weapons themselves. He has to do everything he can to try to rattle the West. I don't think it's going to work. I think it's highly unlikely that Putin would actually use a nuclear weapon for several reasons. Most important, it wouldn't win the war for him. There's no military utility to Putin actually using a nuclear weapons, and the consequences are clear. They would be, as President Biden has said, there would be catastrophic consequences to Putin if he should cross that nuclear barrier, use a nuclear weapon for the first time since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And this includes from his supporters. China has said, you should not do this. India has said you should not do this. We have numerous statements over the last couple of months with people who are supporting Putin, supporting Russia, warning him not to cross that line. So what he's left with is threats, scare tactics, intimidation tactics. I expect to see these ramped up, particularly if the Ukrainian counteroffensive goes well.
Thank you. And before I turn it to the audience to ask questions in the remaining few minutes that we have, I would like you to ask the hardest question possible. And you touched upon this in your opening remarks, but what specifically, how do you see the war end? What would the war end mean both for Ukraine and Russia? How likely are these scenarios that can happen, and what are they contingent upon?
Well, for Europe and the United States, it's very important that Ukraine win and Russia loses. I don't mean Russia is destroyed. I don't mean Putin is overthrown. I mean they lose the war. You know, some people would like him to lose in the most humiliating way possible. I'd just be happy if he lost. And I think that it's quite possible that Ukraine could achieve a military victory here. I think that the Russian military is much more fragile than people believe. I believe the Russian military leadership is quite fragile. I mean, so one of the big stories in just the last week is the infighting in Russia. You have Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, which is this mercenary group. Just saying the name sounds evil. It sounds like some Marvel Comics villain, the Wagner Group. The Wagner Group has been a close ally of Putin. He has been withering in his criticism of the Russian military in the last couple of days. 2 days ago, he captured a lieutenant colonel in the Russian military and held him captive and put him on television, denouncing this colonel because the colonel ordered his troops to open fire on Wagner personnel and Wagner troops. So you literally have armed conflict intra-Russia going on right now, not to mention the kind of cross-border raids we've seen from certain Russian dissident groups who have raided Belgorod, which, by the way, is where some of the nuclear weapons are stored. So I think it's quite possible that Russia could crack, that the Russian military could crack, and I think that's the best case for Ukraine. Another possible case is that the Russian forces get pushed back, not to the pre-February 2002 lines. Well, no, not all the way out of Ukraine, not back to Russia, but pushed back to just the positions they held in the Donbass region right before the invasion, and Crimea, their hold on Crimea becomes very tenuous. And at that point, you might see the Ukrainian forces sort of exhausted. They might have gone as far as they can go, given the limited number of personnel, the limited number of equipment they have. And you might see Putin appeal for a ceasefire. He's been trying to get a ceasefire without asking for it. He's been trying to use pressure on the West to try to get the US to force Ukraine to surrender, basically, to call for a ceasefire. But you could see a ceasefire at that point. At that point, it might be quite appealing to the West, and it might even be appealing to Ukraine to stop the war, even though Russia still has some small portion under its control. If they're reduced to the small portions they had, that's a workable problem. You might be able to come to a political solution. I know Ukraine would prefer the complete expulsion of Russians. I would as well. I would prefer to see a humiliating defeat. It might not be militarily possible, but nobody in the West is going to pressure Ukraine to come to any kind of negotiations, to do any kind of ceasefire discussions until we have an opportunity to see if the Ukrainian counteroffensive could work. So I think the West is united right now behind the Ukrainian effort. I think this offensive is going to take months to play out. It's not going to be a quick victory. It's not going to be like Normandy. 79 years ago, the U.S. forces invaded the beaches of Normandy, massive amount of men and equipment storming ashore, and then quickly moving through France and starting into Germany. And that took a matter of months. It's going to be more diffuse than that, more probing, more until there's a breakthrough, and then you could see armored columns advancing in the ways we sort of think of this kind of combat in Europe, something we haven't really seen since the end of World War II. You might start to see that again. There's so many unknowns. You can't predict this. And most of the military analysts that I respect are not making any predictions of how exactly the offense ends up. But we know that one of Ukraine's goals is to try to cut the land bridge, to reclaim that land that Russia conquered back in February 22, to break the land bridge that allows Russia from Russian territory to directly supply Crimea. If they can do that, they can isolate Crimea and make Russian control of Crimea untenable, make it impossible for Russia to maintain its presence there without directly attacking Crimea. That's the kind of situation Ukraine is trying to get into. We'll see over the next couple of months whether they succeed.
Thank you, Joe, for such detailed answers to difficult but very important questions. Now I would like to invite Rachel to on and help us with the questions from the audience.
Thank you both, Khrystyna and Joe, for being here. It's been such a fascinating discussion, and thank you to our audience for submitting questions. So I want to start with this big picture question. Our audience member said, you earlier compared Russia's losses to the US's in Vietnam as evidence for why Russia's war is flailing. First, will you talk about Ukraine's losses and whether they have the number to continue to defend their country conceivably indefinitely? And second, does Putin have any of the same political considerations regarding casualties that the US presidents did in Vietnam, given our very different political systems?
Excellent question. We believe that Ukraine has suffered about 100,000 casualties, so that's not dead, that's dead and wounded altogether, which is devastating for a country the size of Ukraine, but it pales in comparison to the Russian losses. I see various estimates of Russian losses being 5-1 to Ukraine, 3-1 to Ukraine. Russia, by the way, puts out a completely different story about this. They flip it all around. They claim they've hardly lost any soldiers and that Ukraine has suffered more heavily. We see one of the most important factors in any war is motivation. And the Ukrainians are highly motivated. Remember, they're defending their homes, their territory. They know that if they stop fighting, that they will lose their country. You don't have that kind of motivation on the other side. So it's not just the casualty figures, it's the will of the soldiers to fight and what they're fighting for. And remember, a number of these soldiers have been conscripted into service just in the last year. On the question of conscription, there's something they call mill bloggers, Russian mill bloggers. These are people that are not in the military, but are very active on Russian social media. They're permitted, they're allowed, they're even encouraged. And they've been chattering for months and months and months, demanding a new mass conscription. You remember Putin conscripted about 300,000 citizens, in some cases rounding them up off the streets, raiding homes to get them in, from very young to very old men into the service. The mill bloggers thought that was way too little, and they want to see 500,000 called up, 1 million called up. They want a full national mobilization. To do that, there's no way Putin is going to do that. So even though it's an autocratic system, even though he controls the entire government, even though he controls the economic apparatus and all of state media, think a country where you only had Fox News and it was just being broadcast 24/7 into your house. That's Russia today. That's Russia. 4 or 5 different channels, they're all Fox. They're all doing that kind of propaganda. Even though you control that drafting that many people is politically untenable for Putin, and the casualties, the tolls, the funerals, the news of the deaths are beginning to take a toll. That's one of the reasons I think you see Yevgeny Prigozhin talking up so much. He sees the disaster coming. He sees the failure. He's trying to shift the failure over to the existing military leadership and present himself as the next military leader, maybe the next political leader of Russia. So this is, you can see the sort of the tightrope that even an autocrat like Putin has to negotiate. There's more to say on that, but let me stop there because I tend to give very long answers to very simple questions.
No, thank you so much. It was a great answer. Our next audience member asked, if the Ukrainian counteroffensive is successful, will you compare the results to D-Day in World War II?
Yes. I will. I mean, I really think it's simple. I reread just yesterday, Dwight D. Eisenhower was then the commanding general of all Allied forces, his order of the day, which is very short. And he says to troops that your victory, he knows what's about to happen. He knows he's sending men to their deaths. He knows how many are going to die here, how difficult this is. And anybody who's been to the beaches of Normandy are still amazed to this day that it worked. But he knows what's going to happen. He says, your victory will defeat the Nazi war machine. Your victory will free millions from Nazi oppression. Your victory will guarantee our freedom and democracy for generations to come. I think that is exactly what's at stake for Ukraine right now. And that's why the West is backing them. This offensive could smash Putin's war machine. This offensive could free millions of Ukrainians from occupation. You know, we talk about occupied territory a lot, but it's really occupied people. And after the liberation of what's it, Bucha, up outside Kyiv early in the war, we saw what occupation means. That this is as brutal as anything the Nazis did. I mean, this is just, it's fascism. And we've seen the suffering of those people. And so this means so much to the Ukrainians to be able to reclaim not just their territory, but their people. And so, yes, if this offensive succeeds, you're going to see jubilation in the liberated territories. And if it does smash the machine, you're going to see a huge sigh of relief, not just in Ukraine, but throughout all of Europe. Because remember, one of the reasons Europe is backing Ukraine so much is they know that Putin's ambitions don't end with Ukraine. He sees himself as restoring a Soviet empire. Now, so he compares himself to Peter the Great. He compares himself to Peter the Great's defeat of Sweden in a war centuries ago, where he reclaimed Russian territory. This, he says, it has fallen to us too. We have to reclaim our territory. So yes, a smashing victory by the Ukrainians, it would be comparable to the effort of the Allied forces led by the United States in World War II, with this exception: no Americans are fighting or dying. No Americans. We're just giving the Ukrainians what they need to accomplish the job to expel these brutal invaders.
So our next audience member also had a question about the counteroffensive. There are two reasons for going into Russia, at least along the pre-2014 borders. One, to cut Russian supply lines, and two, to get land for eventual negotiations to end this war. What are your thoughts?
From the very beginning, President Biden has been trying to thread the needle. He's been trying to give the Ukrainians what they needed without provoking Putin, without escalating this. And there's numerous quotes from Putin about this, particularly about U.S., as we were saying, engaging in direct combat. He says, no, we're not going to have Americans fighting Russians. That's World War III. And you know where that goes. And that really does start to raise the nuclear stakes, particularly if Russia feels that its own territory is being threatened. So the U.S. has been, one of the reasons the U.S. hasn't given Ukraine some of the weapons it wants is that it fears Ukrainians will use these weapons. For example, ATACMS, long-range attack missiles, 2, 3, 4 times the range of the missiles we've given them, or advanced fighter jets, that they would use those weapons to attack Russia, and that could escalate the war into a NATO-Russian confrontation. We don't want to do that. So I know for a fact that the administration is nervous about these border incursions. You can understand why Ukraine is doing it. They have good, solid military reasons for doing it. They are effective. It is unnerving Russian political and military leaders to have now to fight battles in their territory, in Russia itself. But it is very risky stuff. And I know the United States is trying as much as it can to discourage those kind of raids, despite their psychological impact, despite their military utility. They don't want to run that kind of risk. I got to hand it to the administration for handling this as deftly as they have. I think they've been too cautious. I think we could have given them tanks months ago, armored personnel carrier months ago, fighter aircraft months ago. I think we should give them ATACMS that could strike deep, for example, at military targets in Crimea. But the administration so far has kept that line at that point. And overall, I think they've handled it well. Overall, I expect them to still try to influence the Ukrainian military to show some restraint.
Our next audience member asked, what role does cyber warfare play in either the Ukraine counteroffensive or the Russian defensive operations?
Cyber warfare, the way we've been thinking about it, not much. I mean, this is a big surprise of the war. I think we overestimated Russian cyber warfare capabilities and underestimated Ukrainian counter cyber warfare capabilities. So you haven't seen a massive cyber attack that takes down Ukraine's electric grid, for example, or disrupts communications. It's been really more on the tactical level. So, for example, there's indications that Russia has been successful in jamming Ukrainian drones. So this is a kind of cyber warfare or electronic warfare where you jam the signals guiding the drones, which is why, I don't know if you noticed that Ukraine doesn't acknowledge this, but there was drone attacks on Moscow a couple of weeks ago, and a lot of them failed. And we think that one of the reasons they failed, they didn't reach their targets, is electronic jamming. So you see that kind, but not the kind of cyber warfare we've been talking about, where you take over air traffic control or you take over industrial facilities. And I haven't seen a real good analysis. This will be after the war kind of analysis you'll see, where the Ukrainians start talking to us and explaining what kind of measures they took to block Russian activity. We still have formidable cyber capabilities. So, for example, if Russia did use a nuclear weapon, there are many, many things we can do in response that don't involve us using nuclear weapons at all. One of them is cyber. We could turn Moscow dark in 24 hours. We could shut Russia down as a country with cyber warfare, sanctions, diplomatic barriers, economic barriers. We have a whole lot of power that we could bring to play to respond to any Russian use of nuclear weapons, which is one of the reasons I believe Putin still remains deterred from using them. I think that's all I wanted to say on that. Did I miss anything that you wanted to hear? Cyber? No, I think that's it for now.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So you mentioned earlier that China has been vocally supportive of Russia, but do we know if they're supporting Russia materially? If so, how? Sanctions-wise, military supply-wise, or otherwise?
Last night I was at a dinner. One of the nice things about, having lived in Washington for 40 years is your friends become important. And so I was at a dinner with a senior American official who was talking very frankly about China understanding what a disaster this war is for them. So even though they have a partnership with Vladimir Putin that is unlimited, as they said, when they announced it before the Olympics, they are not happy with Putin's invasion. They are not happy with how this is going. They're seeing one of their key partners get weaker and weaker and weaker and become an international pariah. So this is not good for China's purposes. They see NATO more organized than ever, bigger than ever, as Finland and Sweden join it, more cohesive than ever. This is not what China wants to see. They see their neighbors, Japan, South Korea, Australia, forming new defensive alliances because they're learning the lessons of Ukraine, and they fear that China might try a similar move with Taiwan. This is not what China wants to see. So none of this is in China's interest. And it's one of the reasons you've seen President Xi of China issue statements like no country should ever use a nuclear weapon. No country should transfer nuclear weapons to other countries. They are quite strong about it, and it's why you haven't seen China give material aid in the form of weapons or resources to Russia in this war, even though Russia has asked for them. The only aid that Russia's gotten is from Iran, that's been drones, and North Korea, which has been some artillery shells. But I'm not aware of any munitions or weapons transfers from China. I don't know if you are, Khrystyna. I haven't seen anything like that. No, I think in some way, even though China's peace plan is largely a series of principles, and they've been doing some shuttle diplomacy, China could end up playing a role in negotiating an end to this war, because they're the only country really out there that can lean on Russia and tell Putin, okay, enough, pull the plug, stop the bleeding. So I think what's one of the reasons the administration is, you may have seen in recent weeks, a warming trend between the US and China. This is not a coincidence. This is what the administration would like to do. They want to walk back from the confrontational dialogue or discussions, or the tone of the discussions that they've had. They think there's a lot of important business we have to conduct with China, and one of them is getting China's help in ending Putin's war on Ukraine.
So I think we have time for one more question, and I want to turn to the possible end of the war eventually. So this audience member said, do you think the West can come up with a security guarantee post-conflict that is somewhere between the Article 5 NATO guarantees which say that if a NATO country is attacked, the other NATO countries will intervene, and the 1994 Budapest Agreement, which was meant to keep nuclear powers from using military aggression against post-Soviet countries.
Boy, you have an informed audience. Yes, yes. And the Budapest Agreement, obviously, we didn't honor. And of course, Russia didn't honor either. And Ukraine is not in NATO, but there's a meeting in Vienna in a couple of weeks where Ukrainian membership in NATO is back on the table again. And I think most NATO countries would like to see Ukraine in NATO. You can't do that now. You can't admit a country into NATO that has an ongoing territorial dispute. So this is blocking Moldova. This is certainly blocking Ukraine. But I think it's clearly in NATO's interest to have Ukraine join NATO at some point. And I mean, for one thing, they now have the best trained, equipped, and experienced military force on the continent. As Tony Blinken said, Secretary of State Tony Blinken said just a couple of days ago in a public speech, kind of trolling Russia. You know, people used to say, so the Russian force was the second best military force in the world. It's clear now that it's the second best military force in Ukraine. And this is, so there's a lot of benefits to having Ukraine come in. Short of that, yes, there's already a lot of discussion about the kinds of security commitments you can give Ukraine. So we're not talking about Ukrainian neutrality, which you hear some pro-Putin people talking about. That's the way we'll solve this. We'll make Ukraine be a buffer state, neutral buffer state. No, we're talking about, you know, a close relationship with NATO that has more concrete security guarantees, but falls short of the full NATO security guarantees. Since I expect Ukraine's going to win this war, I expect that before the end of this decade, you're going to see NATO, you're going to see Ukraine a full member of NATO. It's not going to happen this year, next year, but it's going to happen. This is going to bring Ukraine firmly into the Western orbit, something many in Ukraine have wanted for many years, but have been unable to achieve.
Great. I'd actually like to squeeze in one more question.
Sure.
If we have
I'll be short.
A related question that just came in. And this audience member asked, looking ahead to some form of negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, what are Ukraine's items to put on the table to get what it wants?
Negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, what are Ukraine's assets to put on the table? Well, one would be, we'll stop killing Russian soldiers if you leave. I mean, you know, they are, you can't say Ukraine is winning the war right now, but they, you know, if I were an odds maker in Las Vegas, I would be betting on them to win the war. And of course, you could have security agreements, you know, pledges not to have Ukrainian forces or forces based in Ukraine entering into Russia. You know, you got to be concerned about that. I think, you know, what a lot of people talked about at the beginning of the war, I think will be back on the table soon. How do you give Putin an exit ramp from this? How do you give him some honorable, hate to use that word with Putin, but some sort of respectable way out? And so there's got to be some sweeteners there. But to be honest, here's the real problem with any of that. And it's the question of reparations. Russia has destroyed Eastern Ukraine. We estimate it's going to take $1 trillion to rebuild Ukraine. Where are you going to get that money? Well, some of it could come from frozen Russian funds. I think it's about 300 billion in overseas assets that have been frozen at the beginning of this war. The Western countries could decide that we're going to have those banks turn it over to Ukraine. So that is something, one, Ukraine wants, and it's also a hugely powerful chip that Ukraine has to convince Russia to remove any remaining troops that the Ukrainians have been unable to repel militarily. You could promise them, you do this, and we will go easy on our reparations demands, or we'll balance that. We'll trade you troops for money, some kind of arrangement like that.
Okay, thank you both so much again for being here, and to our audience for so many wonderful questions. This was such a great discussion, and we'll have to have you back, but I'll turn it back over to you, Khrystyna, to close us out.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you to the audience once again for such a lively discussion. Joe, I think we have about 15 seconds for your closing remarks. Is there anything you would like to leave us with today?
It's essential for Ukraine to win this war. We don't want a halfway victory. It's important to defeat Putin decisively. I think the US should make it clear that we don't just stand by Russia for as long as it takes, but that we don't just stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes, but that we want Ukraine to win this war, and that all Russian forces must leave Ukraine, and that includes Crimea. That is the way to guarantee peace in Ukraine for generations to come.
Thank you, Joe. You definitely leave me, and I hope our audience too will leave today with a much more optimistic perspective on what can come next. And now I would like to welcome Kim back to our virtual stage. Kim,
Joe and Khrystyna, you are both terrific. We so appreciate your expertise and helping to really underscore the critical importance of what's going on in Ukraine. So thank you so much for both of you. And we'll have to have you back, as Rachel said, because it'll be unfortunately an ongoing discussion, and we need your expertise in discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kim. It was a pleasure being here.